The bank's letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in April of 1878, carried by a boy on a mule, and it was the second worst piece of paper Susanna Thatcher had ever held in her hands, the first being the coroner's report that had told her, in careful copperplate, that her husband's heart had simply stopped while he stood at his own forge. She read the letter twice standing in the doorway of the smithy, the smell of coal smoke and quenched iron still clinging to the walls, though the forge had not been lit in 11 days. The paper trembled slightly, though her hands did not, and when she finished the second reading she folded it along its original creases and set it on the anvil the way another woman might have set down a viper, careful not to let it strike. Larkspur Creek, Wyoming Territory, was not a large town, but it had a bank, a church, a mercantile, a saloon that did double duty as a meeting hall, and a sheriff named Wyatt Boone who tried his best to keep the peace among cattlemen, sheepmen, and the handful of homesteaders who had staked their claims along the creek bottom in the years since the railroad had crawled its way across the territory. It had, until 11 days ago, also had a blacksmith, and Jebediah Thatcher had been a fixture of that town for the better part of 8 years, a broad, quiet man with a laugh that rolled out of his chest like distant thunder and hands that could shape a horseshoe or a hinge or a plow blade with the same patient certainty. Susanna had married him in Ohio when she was 21 years old, the daughter of a blacksmith herself, raised from girlhood among the ring of hammers and the hiss of steam off quenched metal, and she had followed him west with her father's blessing, and her mother's good linen packed into a trunk, believing, as young brides do, that the road ahead was long but the love beside her was longer still. They had homesteaded 160 acres along Larkspur Creek in the spring of 1873, built first a soddy and then a proper frame house, and Jebediah had raised the smithy with his own 2 hands, log by log, until it stood solid and square at the edge of the claim, close enough to the wagon road that farmers and drovers alike could find him. Now the smithy stood cold, and the letter on the anvil said that Cornelius Vance, president of the Larkspur Creek Trust and Savings Bank, wished to inform Mrs. Thatcher that the promissory note her late husband had signed against the smithy's tools and stock, in the amount of $420, was due in full within 60 days, and that furthermore, given certain irregularities in the land claim, the bank's attorney had advised that the property itself might revert to the public domain, in which case the bank would be pleased to assist Mrs. Thatcher in an orderly settlement of her affairs. She did not cry. She had done her crying already, in the 11 days since they buried Jebediah beneath the cottonwood tree on the hill behind the house, where he had once told her he wanted to rest so he could hear the creek. She had cried until she thought there was nothing left in her, and what she found instead, standing in the doorway of the cold smithy with that letter folded on the anvil, was something harder and more useful than tears. It settled into her chest like a coal banked for the night, waiting only for air to make it burn. She had grown up believing that a forge was a place where broken things were made whole, and where raw iron, given enough heat and enough striking, could be shaped into whatever a person needed it to be. She did not yet know how she would answer Cornelius Vance's letter, but she knew, standing there with the cold ash of her husband's last fire still in the pit, that she was not going to let a banker's paper undo 8 years of her life without a fight. Jebediah had built the smithy with a wide loft above the forge floor where they had once slept before the house was finished, and it was there, going through her husband's strongbox 2 days later, that Susanna found the original claim papers, brittle and yellowed, filed in 1873 under the Homestead Act of 1862, bearing Jebediah's signature and the seal of the land office in Cheyenne. She spread them across the kitchen table and read them by lamplight until her eyes ached, searching for whatever irregularity the bank's attorney had found, and she found nothing she could name, only the plain fact that the paper was a certificate of entry, not a patent, and that a homestead claim required 5 years of proven residence and improvement before the government would grant final title. Jebediah had filed his claim in June of 1873. He had died in April of 1878, 1 month shy of the 5th anniversary of that filing. She understood, reading it again, why the bank's attorney had smelled blood. If the claim was never proved up, if no one appeared before the land office to swear the residency had been completed and pay the final fees, then in the eyes of the government the land might revert to the public domain, open again for any man to file upon, and a bank with friends in the land office might arrange for a favored client to file first. She sat at the table long after the lamp had burned low, her husband's papers spread before her like the pieces of a puzzle she did not yet know how to solve, and she thought, not for the first time since his death, that grief and fear made poor company but excellent teachers, if a woman was willing to learn from them. The town of Larkspur Creek had watched Susanna Thatcher bury her husband and had expected, as towns often do, that she would soon sell the smithy for whatever it would fetch and take the stage east to whatever family remained to her. Mrs. Odell, who ran the mercantile with her husband and had been Susanna's closest friend since the day the Thatchers arrived, said as much over coffee one morning, not unkindly, but as a woman states a fact she believes to be settled. "You could not blame yourself for going," Mrs. Odell said. "A smithy is no place for a woman alone, Susanna. The heat alone would kill you inside a year, to say nothing of the iron." "My father raised me at a forge," Susanna said. "I have breathed coal smoke since before I could talk. It will not be the smithy that kills me, Prudence. It will be men who think a widow has no more use for her own land than to hand it over quietly." Mrs. Odell had not argued further, though her eyes had gone wide and worried, and word had gotten around Larkspur Creek within the week that the blacksmith's widow intended to keep the forge burning herself, with the help of Jebediah's young apprentice, a boy of 19 named Tobias Reed, who had no family of his own and had slept in the smithy loft since he was 15 years old. It was not easy. Susanna had watched her husband work 1,000 times, had helped him at the bellows and the tongs more evenings than she could count, but there was a great difference between assisting and shaping, between holding the metal steady and knowing, by instinct built over years, exactly when the iron had reached the color that meant it would bend and not crack. Her first horseshoes were clumsy things, and she burned her forearm badly on the second day, a long red welt that would scar pale and shining for the rest of her life. But she did not stop, and by the end of the second week, the shoes coming off her anvil were true enough that old Pete Callahan, foreman of the Circle B ranch, allowed as how they would do just fine, and paid her in full without complaint. Cornelius Vance visited the smithy himself on a bright, cold morning near the end of April, dressed in a black coat too fine for the dust of Larkspur Creek, his mustache waxed and his boots polished, a man who had clearly never swung a hammer in his life and took some pride in that fact. He stood in the doorway of the smithy and watched Susanna work the bellows for a long moment before he spoke, as though he found the sight of her there faintly absurd, a woman in a leather apron with soot on her cheek, doing a man's work in a man's shop. "Mrs. Thatcher," he said, "I had hoped we might speak somewhere more comfortable." "I am comfortable enough here, Mr. Vance," she said, not pausing in her work, though her heart had begun to hammer nearly as loud as the forge. "This is my husband's shop. Anything you have to say to me, you may say it here." He studied her a moment, then inclined his head, conceding the point with the air of a man who had decided the argument was not worth having yet. "Very well. I trust you received my letter." "I did." "Then you understand the position you are in. Your husband's note to the bank is due, and while I have every sympathy for your loss, the bank cannot extend credit indefinitely on a claim that may not survive government scrutiny. I would rather see this resolved amicably, Mrs. Thatcher. I have made inquiries, and I believe the bank could offer you a fair sum for the improvements on this land, enough to see you comfortably settled elsewhere. It would spare you the indignity of a foreclosure sale. And what would the bank do with the land once it had paid me this fair sum for my own house? Vance smiled, the smile of a man who believed himself patient with a difficult child. The territory grows, Mrs. Thatcher. The railroad is pushing a spur line north of Cheyenne within the next 2 years, and a man in my position must think of such things. This creek bottom would serve well as a depot site. I do not say this to distress you. I say it because I believe you are a sensible woman, and sensible women do not fight the tide of progress. I am a sensible woman, Susanna said, setting down her hammer at last and turning to face him fully, soot and all. Sensible enough to know that my husband filed a legal claim on this land 5 years ago, and sensible enough to wonder why a banker is so eager to see it revert to the government before that claim can be proved up, unless he intends to be standing at the land office door the very day it opens again. For just a moment, something flickered behind Cornelius Vance's carefully composed features, gone as quickly as it appeared. But Susanna had spent enough years reading the temper of hot iron to recognize the tell of a man caught out. He recovered his smile, touched the brim of his hat, and told her he hoped she would reconsider before the note came due, and then he left, his fine boots picking a careful path through the mud and manure of the yard. Susanna stood in the doorway long after his buggy had disappeared down the road toward town, her arms crossed over her apron, and she found that the coal banked in her chest since the day of that first letter had caught, at last, a proper flame. Arthur Atkins came to Larkspur Creek 3 days later, driving 11 head of cattle before him on the last leg of a drive that had started 6 weeks earlier in the Nebraska Panhandle, bound for a rail sighting 2 counties west, where the Circle B intended to ship them east. He was 33 years old, lean from years in the saddle, with sun-weathered skin and pale gray eyes that had seen enough of the world to be careful with what they trusted, and a gelding named Samson who had thrown a shoe somewhere along the last stretch of rocky ground and gone lame enough that Arthur had no choice but to stop and see to it before pushing on. He asked at the mercantile where he might find a farrier, and Mrs. Odell, who had strong opinions about the injustice being done to her friend, and was not shy about sharing them with strangers, told him there was a fine blacksmith just north along the creek road, though he ought to know before he went that the smith in question was a widow doing the work herself, on account of a bank that seemed determined to steal the roof from over her head. "Is that so?" Arthur said, more out of politeness than genuine interest, though something in the way Mrs. Odell said it, sharp and indignant, made him look at her twice. "It is so," Mrs. Odell said. "Cornelius Vance thinks because Susanna Thatcher has no husband standing behind her, she has no rights at all. I would like to see him tell that to her face and have her not put a horseshoe through his hat." Arthur laughed despite himself, thanked her, and led his lame horse north along the creek road until he came upon the smithy, and it was there, standing in the yard with Samson's reins in his hand, that he first saw Susanna Thatcher working the bellows with Tobias Reed at her side, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, sweat and soot on her face, a woman entirely unlike any he had encountered in a smithy before, which was to say, entirely capable. "Afternoon," he said when she looked up. "My horse threw a shoe 2 days back and has gone tender on that foot. I would be obliged if you could see to him." Susanna wiped her forearm across her brow, studying the stranger a moment before she nodded toward the hitching rail. "Bring him in and let me look. What is his name?" "Samson." "Fitting for a horse that has lost his strength to a bad shoe," she said, and there was the faintest curve at the corner of her mouth, the first thing resembling a smile Arthur had seen cross her face, though he could not have known that, having only just met her. She examined the hoof with a competence that surprised him, running her thumb along the frog and the sole, checking for a stone bruise or a crack before she pronounced it a simple matter of a poorly fitted shoe that had pulled loose and torn the hoof wall slightly on its way off. She told him it would need a day's rest before she reshod him properly, to let the wall settle, and Arthur, who had intended to be 3 counties further west by the end of the week, found himself agreeing to stay the night in Larkspur Creek without quite deciding to. He took a room above the saloon, ate a supper of beans and salt pork, and found himself, an hour later, walking back up the creek road in the blue dusk toward the smithy, telling himself it was only to check on his horse. Susanna was still awake, sitting on the porch step of the small frame house adjoining the smithy yard, a lamp burning low in the window behind her, and she watched him come up the road with an expression that was not quite suspicion and not quite welcome, the careful watchfulness of a woman who had learned, in the space of a few short weeks, that men who came calling after dark rarely came for good reasons. "Your horse is resting easy," she said, before he could ask. "I checked him an hour ago. I did not doubt you." Arthur stood at the edge of the yard, hat in his hands, feeling suddenly foolish for having come at all. "I only wanted to say, ma'am, that I heard in town about your trouble with the bank. I am sorry for it." "Are you?" Her voice was flat, guarded. "Everyone in this town is sorry for it, Mr. Atkins. Arthur Atkins. Mr. Atkins. Everyone is sorry for it, and not one of them has offered to do a thing about it besides feel sorry." Something in her voice, tired and bitter in equal measure, made Arthur step closer, though he stopped himself at the edge of the porch, mindful of his welcome. "I might be able to do something about it if you would let me." She looked at him properly then, taking his measure the way she might take the measure of a piece of iron before deciding what heat it would need. And what would a drover know about banks and land claims? "More than most drovers, I expect," Arthur said. "Before I ever sat a saddle for wages, I clerked 2 years in the land office at Grand Island, Nebraska. I know the Homestead Act about as well as any man who did not write it himself. If your trouble is what I think it is, from what I heard in town, it might not be as hopeless as the bank wants you to believe." Susanna was silent a long moment, the lamplight flickering behind her, and when she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its guard, though none of its wariness. "You had better come in, then, Mr. Atkins, and look at my husband's papers, because I have read them a dozen times and I cannot find my way clear of this myself." She led him into the small kitchen, where Jebediah's strongbox still sat open on the table amid the scattered papers, and by lamplight, over 2 cups of coffee gone cold and forgotten, Arthur Atkins read through the certificate of entry, the survey notes, and the letters from the bank, while Susanna watched his face for whatever answer he might find there. "Your husband filed proper," he said finally. "Certificate of entry dated June the 14th, 1873. 5 years proof required that would fall due June of this year, just under 2 months from now. Your husband died before he could file the proof. That much is true, and the bank is not wrong that an unproven claim can be canceled and the land thrown open again." Susanna's face fell, the small flicker of hope in it dimming, but Arthur held up a hand before she could speak. "But that is not the whole of the law, Mrs. Thatcher, and I would wager Cornelius Vance is counting on you not knowing the rest of it. The Homestead Act was amended some years back, precisely for cases such as yours. When a claimant dies before completing his proof, the right to complete that proof and receive the patent passes to his widow, or if there is no widow, to his heirs. You do not lose the claim because your husband died before proving it up, Mrs. Thatcher. You inherit the right to prove it up yourself." For a long moment Susanna could not speak at all. She had spent 11 days believing that her husband's death had cost her everything, the man she loved and the ground beneath her feet both, and here was a stranger with sun-cracked hands and tired gray eyes telling her, over cold coffee at her own kitchen table, that the ground at least was still hers to fight for. "You are certain," she said when she found her voice again, "you are certain the law says this?" "I clerked 2 years at that desk, ma'am. I filed proof of claim for no fewer than 6 widows in that time, each one under this very provision. I am certain." "Then why," Susanna said slowly, "would Cornelius Vance tell me the claim was as good as lost when he must know full well I have the right to complete it?" Arthur set down the paper he had been holding and met her eyes across the lamplight. "Because he is hoping you never learn otherwise before the deadline passes, Mrs. Thatcher. A claim not proved up by its deadline is cancelled outright, whatever the law says about a widow's right to complete it. The right does you no good if you do not exercise it in time, and in the meantime he is calling due a note on your husband's tools, hoping to force you off the land before you can ever get to Cheyenne to file." Susanna sat back slowly in her chair, and something in her chest that had been clenched tight since the day of that first letter began, for the first time, to loosen. "Then I must go to Cheyenne." "You must," Arthur agreed, "and soon. The proof requires witnesses who can swear to 5 years of continuous residence and cultivation. It requires the filing fee, and it requires it done before your deadline in June, or the whole claim lapses regardless of the law's mercy toward widows. I have witnesses enough. Prudence Odell has known us since we arrived. Old Pete Callahan has bought horseshoes from this forge for 6 years running." She looked at him, something new in her expression now, cautious but no longer hopeless. "I do not know how to thank you for this, Mr. Atkins." "You have not thanked me yet, ma'am. I have only told you what the law says. Whether you can get to Cheyenne, gather your witnesses, and file before June, with a banker doing everything in his power to see you fail first, that is another matter entirely." He paused, turning his hat over once in his hands, and when he spoke again there was something more careful in his voice, something that had nothing to do with land law at all. "I have no particular place I need to be, Mrs. Thatcher. My herd is delivered as far as I am contracted to take them, and the Circle B does not need me again until the fall roundup. If you would permit it, I would like to help you see this through." Susanna studied him a long moment in the lamplight, this stranger who had walked into her yard with a lame horse and walked out somehow, holding the one thread of hope she had been given since her husband's death. "Why would you do that, Mr. Atkins? You do not know me. You have no stake in this land." Arthur was quiet a moment, and when he answered, his voice was low and honest in a way that made Susanna's breath catch, though she would not have admitted it even to herself just then. "I have watched banks and land agents cheat honest people out of what was rightfully theirs more times than I care to count, Mrs. Thatcher, back when I sat behind that desk in Grand Island and had no power to stop it beyond filing the papers correctly and hoping the law held. It never sat right with me, watching it happen and doing nothing more than my job required. I expect I have been waiting a long while for a chance to do something more than my job required." It was not, Susanna thought later, lying awake in the small hours with Jebediah's papers still spread across her kitchen table, a declaration of anything beyond what it claimed to be, a man's plain conscience speaking plainly. And yet something in the steadiness of his gray eyes, as he said it, had settled into her chest alongside the banked coal of her own determination, and she found she could not entirely separate the two. The following morning, Cornelius Vance discovered, by way of the town's telegraph operator, that a wire had gone out the previous evening from the Larkspur Creek station, addressed to the Register of the United States Land Office in Cheyenne, inquiring after the status of a claim entry dated June 1873 under the name of Jebediah Thatcher. He discovered this because he had, for some months, been paying the telegraph operator a small consideration to inform him of any wires touching upon land matters, an arrangement he had made not from any particular malice, but from the plain business sense of a man who intended to profit from the coming rail spur and did not care to be surprised by competitors. He sat in his office above the bank that afternoon, turning the information over in his mind with the same careful attention he gave to a column of figures that would not balance. He had believed, reasonably, that a young widow freshly grieving and entirely without legal counsel would have no notion of the widow's provision buried in the amendments to the Homestead Act, a provision obscure enough that even some land agents forgot to mention it. Someone had told her. He had heard, from more than one source in town, that a drover had stopped at the smithy to have his horse shod, and had stayed rather longer than a simple shoeing required. Cornelius Vance did not consider himself a wicked man. He considered himself a practical one, a man who understood that fortunes in the territory were made by those bold enough to see an opportunity before their neighbors did, and he had seen, in the coming rail spur and the creek bottom land along Larkspur Creek, an opportunity worth a great deal more than $420. He was not accustomed to being outmaneuvered by a blacksmith's widow, and he did not intend to become accustomed to it now. He called upon two men that evening, brothers named Silas and Amos Bragg, who did occasional rough work for the bank when rough work was required, and instructed them, in terms vague enough to preserve his own deniability but clear enough to be understood, that the smithy on the Thatcher claim might benefit from a small reminder of how precarious its situation truly was. The Bragg brothers rode out to the smithy 2 nights later, under a moon thin enough to hide their approach, and did what damage they could without setting foot inside the forge itself, where Tobias Reed slept and might have raised an alarm. They tore down the split-rail fence along the north pasture, scattered the small flock of chickens Susanna kept for eggs, and left, tied to the smithy's front post, a dead crow with a scrap of paper wound around its leg bearing no words at all, only a crude drawing of a house in flames, a message that needed no reading to be understood. Susanna found it at first light, and though her hands shook as she cut the twine free and buried the crow behind the barn, she found, to her own quiet surprise, that fear was not the feeling that rose loudest in her chest. It was anger, clean and hard as tempered steel, and beneath the anger, a resolve that had not existed in her before her husband's death, when she had been content to let Jebediah stand between her and the harder edges of the world. She rode into town that same morning and found Sheriff Wyatt Boone at his office beside the jail, a broad, unhurried man in his 50s who had kept the peace in Larkspur Creek for the better part of a decade, and had buried enough friends and neighbors to have developed a healthy suspicion of any trouble that arrived dressed in a banker's fine coat. A dead crow and a burned fence is not much to arrest a man over, Mrs. Thatcher, Boone said, turning his hat slowly in his hands as he listened to her account, even if I had proof it was Vance's doing, which I do not. I am not asking you to arrest anyone yet, Sheriff. I am asking you to know what is happening so that when I do have proof, you will not be surprised by it. Susanna's voice was steady, though her hands, folded tight in her lap, betrayed the effort it cost her to keep it so. And I am asking you to remember, when the day comes, that the law is supposed to protect a widow's claim every bit as much as it protects a banker's note. Boone studied her a long moment, something like respect gathering slowly in his weathered face. I remember the law well enough, Mrs. Thatcher. I have simply never had cause to test whether Cornelius Vance remembers it. Then perhaps it is time he was reminded. Arthur Atkins had ridden into town that same morning to send another wire, this one requesting the land office confirm what documents would be needed for a widow's proof of claim, and it was outside the telegraph office that he found Susanna emerging from the sheriff's office, her jaw set and her eyes bright with an anger she had not yet spent. "What happened?" he said, more statement than question, reading her face before she said a word. She told him, walking beside him down the dusty main street of Larkspur Creek, while he listened with a stillness that reminded her, oddly, of the moment just before a piece of iron reaches its working heat, a quiet that was not calm so much as it was contained force. "He is frightened," Arthur said, when she had finished. "A man who is winning does not send the Bragg brothers to kill chickens in the dark. He sends them because he knows the ground is shifting under him and he cannot think of a better way to stop it. That is a comfort, I suppose. It is more than a comfort, Mrs. Thatcher. It is information. It tells us we do not have as much time as I hoped, but it also tells us we are closer to beating him than either of us dared believe 2 days ago." He stopped walking, turning to face her fully in the street, the noon sun bright on his weathered face. "We should leave for Cheyenne within the week. The sooner your proof is filed and recorded, the sooner nothing Vance does in the dark will matter at all." The journey to Cheyenne took the better part of 3 days by wagon, along the wagon road that followed the rail line east and south through country that shifted from creek bottom green to the high dry plains, where antelope watched their passage with idle curiosity, and the wind never seemed to stop. Susanna drove the wagon herself, with Tobias Reed left behind to mind the smithy and the animals, and Arthur rode alongside on Samson, whose hoof had healed clean and strong under Susanna's care. They spoke over those 3 days of things that had nothing to do with land claims or banks. Susanna told him of her father's forge in Ohio, of the summer she had turned 16 and burned her hand badly enough that her father had nearly forbidden her the shop entirely, before relenting when he saw how fiercely she had argued to stay. She told him of Jebediah, carefully at first, and then with more ease as she came to understand that Arthur listened to her grief without flinching from it or trying to hurry her past it, the way some men did, uncomfortable with a woman's sorrow. "He was not a man of many words," she said, on the second evening, as they made camp beside a dry wash with a small fire of buffalo chips and scrub brush burning low against the coming dark. "But he showed his love in the work of his hands. Every hinge on our door, every latch, every nail, he set with more care than most men give to words of courtship. I did not understand when I was young that this was its own kind of poetry. I think I understand it," Arthur said quietly, watching the fire. "I have spent a good part of my life around men who could not say a tender word to save their lives, and yet you could watch them shoe a horse, or mend a fence, or sit up all night with a sick calf, and know everything about the size of their hearts." Susanna glanced at him across the firelight, something warm stirring in her chest that she had not expected and was not entirely sure what to do with. "Is that how you show it, Mr. Atkins? In the work of your hands?" He met her eyes, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the fire crackling between them and the vast dark of the plain stretching away on every side. "I expect I have not had much occasion to show it at all, ma'am, in one way or the other. I have spent most of my adult life moving from one job to the next, never staying long enough in one place to plant anything, let alone tend it. And now, Arthur said slowly, I find myself 3 days from home, if I have a home at all, riding beside a woman who has more courage than any person I have met in a decade, and I find I am in no particular hurry to reach Cheyenne, though I know full well how much depends on getting there." Susanna felt the warmth in her chest deepen into something she had not allowed herself to feel since long before Jebediah's death, a fluttering, uncertain hope that had nothing to do with land claims at all, and she looked away first into the fire, afraid of what her face might show if she held his gaze a moment longer. "We should sleep," she said softly. "We have a long way yet to travel." "Yes," Arthur agreed, though his voice carried the same reluctance hers had. "We do." They arrived in Cheyenne on the 3rd day, a city grown busy and prosperous on the strength of the Union Pacific Railroad, its streets crowded with freight wagons and cattle buyers, and the particular restless energy of a territory still finding its shape. The United States Land Office occupied a plain brick building near the depot, and it was there, on a warm afternoon in early May, that Susanna Thatcher walked through the door with her husband's certificate of entry in one hand and Arthur Atkins at her side, prepared to fight for the one thing left to her that no banker had any right to take. The register of the land office, a tired-looking man named Horace Higgins, who had clearly seen every manner of claim dispute the territory could produce, listened to Susanna's account with a patience that suggested he had heard variations of this story before, though perhaps not with quite the same clean fury behind the telling. "You understand, Mrs. Thatcher," Higgins said, when she had finished, "that the provision you speak of is real enough, but it requires proof. I cannot simply take your word, however sincerely given, that 5 years of residence and cultivation occurred as your husband's certificate claims. I will need witnesses willing to swear to it under oath, and I will need the filing fee, which is $14. I have brought both, Susanna said, and produced from her carpet bag 2 sworn affidavits, gathered before their departure from Larkspur Creek, one from Prudence Odell and one from Pete Callahan, each attesting under notarized oath to the continuous residence, house, barn, smithy, and cultivated acreage of the Thatcher claim since the summer of 1873. She had ridden to the Circle B Ranch herself, 2 days before their departure for Cheyenne, and asked Pete Callahan to his face whether he would swear to what he knew, and the old foreman, who had bought 100 horseshoes from that forge and thought highly of the woman who now made them, had signed without a moment's hesitation. Higgins read the affidavits carefully, checking each against the original certificate of entry, and when he looked up again, there was something in his expression that had shifted, not quite warmth but a professional respect that had not been there before. "This is thorough, Mrs. Thatcher. More thorough than most proofs I see filed by men who have had 5 years to prepare them, let alone a widow given 6 weeks. I did not prepare it alone," Susanna said, glancing at Arthur, who stood quietly by the window with his hat in his hands, having insisted, throughout the whole of the proceedings, on letting Susanna speak for herself. "Mr. Atkins here clerked in the Grand Island office some years back. He knew what this office would require, and he made certain we did not arrive unprepared." Higgins looked between them, something almost like a smile touching the corner of his tired mouth. "Then Mr. Atkins did you a great service, ma'am, because I have seen widows turned away from this very desk for want of exactly this kind of preparation." He set the affidavits aside and reached for a fresh form. "I will accept your proof, Mrs. Thatcher, pending final review, and I will forward the certificate of entry, the affidavits, and your filing fee to the General Land Office in Washington for confirmation of patent. That confirmation typically takes some months, but I can issue you today a certified receipt showing your proof has been accepted and filed, which will be sufficient to establish your claim against any challenge in the meantime." "That is all I need," Susanna said and felt, for the first time since Cornelius Vance's letter had arrived on the back of a mule, something like solid ground beneath her feet again. But Higgins was not finished. He set down his pen and studied Susanna a moment with an expression that had grown suddenly more careful. "I will tell you something else, Mrs. Thatcher, though it is not strictly my place to say it. Some weeks back, a man came through this office asking after unproved claims along Larkspur Creek that might soon revert to the public domain, wishing to know how quickly he might file upon such land once it became available. He gave the name of a client he represented, a banker in your town, though I will not say the name aloud in an official capacity, only that you should know such inquiries have been made." "Cornelius Vance," Susanna said quietly. Higgins did not confirm it outright, but the look he gave her was answer enough. "I would advise you, Mrs. Thatcher, to keep your certified receipt someplace safe, and to make certain your banker understands as clearly as possible that your claim is filed, accepted, and beyond any legitimate challenge. A man who has been planning to profit from another's misfortune does not always take kindly to that misfortune being resolved." They stayed one night in Cheyenne, in separate rooms at a modest boarding house near the depot, and Susanna lay awake a long while in the unfamiliar bed, her certified receipt folded carefully inside her husband's old strongbox, thinking not of banks or land claims, but of the way Arthur Atkins had stood quietly by the window all afternoon, letting her carry the weight of her own fight, offering his knowledge without ever once trying to take the victory from her hands. She had loved Jebediah Thatcher with the whole of her young heart, and she did not think, lying there in the dark, that what she felt stirring now was any kind of betrayal of that love, but something new growing carefully in the space grief had left behind, the way new grass rises green through the ash of a burned field. The journey home took another 3 days, and on the second evening, camped once more beneath the vast plains sky, Arthur Atkins finally said the thing he had been turning over in his mind since the fire beside the dry wash 3 nights before their arrival in Cheyenne. "Susanna," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name rather than the careful formality of Mrs. Thatcher, and she felt the small shock of it warm through her chest. "I do not know what claim I have to say this, given how short a time we have known each other, and given all that you have lost this past month. But I find that I do not wish to simply ride on toward whatever job the fall roundup brings, once your claim is settled and safe. I find that I would like very much to stay in Larkspur Creek, if you would have me stay." Susanna sat very still, the fire between them casting small shifting shadows across both their faces, and when she spoke her voice was quiet but sure. "I buried my husband not 2 months ago, Arthur. I do not think it seemly to speak of such things so soon." "I do not ask you to speak of anything you are not ready to speak of," Arthur said gently. "I only wished you to know where my heart stands, so that whatever time you need to grieve, and whatever time you need to decide what you want for the rest of your life, you would know that I intend to be nearby if you will permit it, not because I expect anything of you, but because I have not felt, in all my years of drifting from one place to the next, anything close to what I feel sitting across this fire from you." Susanna looked at him a long moment, this quiet, careful man who had ridden into her life with a lame horse and had somehow, in the space of 2 short weeks, given her back not only her land but the first flicker of something resembling hope for a future beyond mere survival. "I have not decided what I want for the rest of my life, Arthur Atkins," she said finally. "But I know that I do not wish you to leave Larkspur Creek either, not yet, and perhaps that is answer enough for tonight." They arrived back in Larkspur Creek on a warm afternoon in the middle of May, to find the town buzzing with the news that Cornelius Vance had called a special meeting of the town council, to be held that very evening at the saloon, on the matter of the Thatcher property and the outstanding note against it. Word had it that Vance intended to press for immediate foreclosure, arguing before the assembled council and whatever townsfolk cared to attend that the note was due. The claim was defective, and the widow Thatcher had no legal recourse but to settle her affairs and vacate the property within the month. Susanna received this news from Tobias Reed, who met their wagon at the edge of town with the anxious energy of a young man who had spent the past week minding a smithy and worrying over his employer's absence in equal measure, and she felt the old fear rise briefly in her chest before the memory of the certified receipt, folded safe in her strongbox, steadied it. "Then we will attend this meeting," she said, "and Cornelius Vance will discover that his widow has not spent the past week weeping into her handkerchief." The saloon was crowded that evening, more crowded than Susanna had ever seen it, word of the confrontation having spread through Larkspur Creek with the particular speed reserved for stories involving both money and scandal. Cornelius Vance stood near the bar in his fine black coat, flanked by his bank's attorney, a thin, nervous man named Pemberton, and by Sheriff Wyatt Boone, who had positioned himself, Susanna noted, not beside Vance but at a neutral distance, his arms crossed and his expression carefully unreadable, a lawman determined to see fair play rather than take sides before the facts were laid out. Vance began, when the meeting was called to order by the town council's chairman, with a recitation of the facts as he wished them understood. A promissory note of $420, signed by the late Jebediah Thatcher, now overdue and unpaid. A homestead claim filed in 1873 but never proved up due to the claimant's untimely death. And a widow, however sympathetically regarded by the town, who possessed no legal standing to prevent the bank from calling its note or the land from reverting to the public domain. "I take no pleasure in this," Vance said, his voice pitched to carry the particular sorrowful gravity of a man performing reluctance he did not feel. "But the bank has obligations to its depositors, and the law is the law. I have consulted counsel, and Mr. Pemberton will confirm that an unproved claim, upon the death of the claimant, is subject to cancellation, and the land reverts. The land reverts to the public domain only if no one completes the proof within the statutory period. Mr. Vance, Susanna said, rising from her seat near the back of the room, her voice steady and carrying easily over the murmur that had begun among the assembled townsfolk at her arrival. And you know that as well as I do, because you sent a man to the land office in Cheyenne some weeks ago to inquire exactly how soon this claim might come open for filing, should the widow prove too grieving or too ignorant to know her rights. The murmur in the room sharpened into something closer to a collective gasp, and Cornelius Vance's carefully composed expression flickered, just as it had in the smithy doorway weeks before, though he recovered it quickly. I do not know what you mean to imply, Mrs. Thatcher, but I assure you, I do not need to imply anything, Mr. Vance, because I have proof. Susanna walked to the front of the room, drawing from her carpet bag the certified receipt from the land office in Cheyenne, and held it aloft for the assembled council and townsfolk to see, her voice ringing clear and unshaken through the crowded saloon. This document, certified and dated the 7th of May, 1878, confirms that my proof of claim on the Thatcher homestead has been accepted and filed with the United States Land Office, under the provision of law that allows a widow to complete her deceased husband's homestead entry in her own name. My claim is not defective, Mr. Vance. My claim is secure, pending final patent, and no bank in this territory has the authority to declare otherwise. Pemberton, the bank's attorney, stepped forward to examine the document, his thin face growing paler as he read it, and when he looked up at Vance, there was a warning in his expression that needed no words to convey. This appears to be entirely in order, Cornelius. If the register in Cheyenne has accepted this proof, then the land is secured to Mrs. Thatcher regardless of the note's status. We may still pursue payment of the note itself, but the land cannot be seized on grounds of claim reversion, not with this receipt standing against it. The room had gone very quiet, every eye in the saloon fixed on Cornelius Vance, who stood very still for a long moment, his jaw working as though he were chewing on something bitter before he spoke again, his voice tighter now, stripped of its earlier performance of sorrowful reluctance. The note remains due regardless, Mrs. Thatcher. $420 plus accrued interest. I do not see how a certificate from Cheyenne changes that plain fact. It does not, Susanna agreed, and reached again into her carpet bag, producing a second, smaller pouch that she set upon the table before the town council with a solid, deliberate weight. Which is why I have brought the payment in full, Mr. Vance, in coin, along with interest calculated to the day, so that you may take your note and be satisfied, and never again have cause to threaten a widow's home over a debt that was never in danger of going unpaid. Vance stared at the pouch, and then at Susanna, something almost like admiration warring with his fury in the depths of his expression, though it was fury that won out in the end. And where does a blacksmith's widow come by $420 in coin, might I ask? From honest work at an honest forge, Mr. Vance, the same as any tradesman earns his living, Susanna said. I have shod every horse in this county these past 6 weeks, and old Pete Callahan will confirm I have not turned away a single job. I did not spend my time weeping in a parlor, waiting for a banker's mercy. I spent it earning the right to tell you, in front of this entire town, to take your money and never darken my doorway again. There was a beat of silence, and then, from somewhere near the bar, old Pete Callahan began to laugh, a great booming sound that broke the tension like a hammer through thin ice, and within moments the whole saloon had taken up the sound, laughter and scattered applause rolling through the crowd, and Cornelius Vance stood very small and very red-faced at the center of it, his fine black coat suddenly looking absurd amid the rough good humor of a town that had, in that moment, chosen its side entirely. Pemberton, ever the practical man, stepped forward and gathered the pouch of coin with the resigned efficiency of an attorney who understood a lost cause when he saw one, counted it swiftly, and pronounced the note satisfied in full. Vance said nothing further, only turned and walked from the saloon with what dignity he could still muster, and the town council chairman, a good-natured storekeeper named Elijah Turner, banged his gavel and declared the matter closed, to renewed laughter and applause. Susanna stood at the center of the crowded room, breathing hard, her heart still hammering from the confrontation, and it was only when the crowd began to disperse into smaller knots of conversation and congratulation that she found Arthur Atkins at her side, his gray eyes bright with something that looked very much like pride. "You did not need my help at all in the end," he said quietly, as the noise of the saloon rose around them. "You could have walked in there and done all of that without a single word from me." "I could not have," Susanna said, and found to her own surprise that her voice had gone soft and unsteady in a way it had not been throughout the whole confrontation with Vance. "I would never have known the law existed, Arthur. I would have lost everything and never even understood why." "You would have found another way," Arthur said. "I have known you 2 weeks, Susanna Thatcher, and in that time I have watched you learn a trade most men would call impossible for a woman to master, watched you outmaneuver a corrupt banker with nothing but your own wits and courage, and watched you stand in front of this whole town and speak truth to a man who thought he could frighten you into silence. I do not believe there is very much in this world you could not find a way through, given time enough." Susanna felt her eyes sting, unexpectedly, and she blinked hard against the sudden press of emotion, standing there amid the noise and laughter of the saloon. "Then perhaps," she said softly, "it is not that I needed your help to survive this, Arthur, but that I am glad all the same that I did not have to survive it alone." He reached for her hand then, gently, giving her every chance to pull away if she wished it, and when she did not, when her fingers curled instead around his, rough palm against rough palm, 2 people who had each spent long years learning to be strong alone, something settled between them as certain and unshakable as iron cooled true from the forge. The weeks that followed brought a kind of quiet Susanna had not known since before her husband's death, though it was a different quiet than the one she had shared with Jebediah, less the comfortable silence of long familiarity and more the tentative, hopeful quiet of something new taking root. Arthur did not leave Larkspur Creek, as he had told her beside the fire he did not wish to, and instead took work at the Circle B ranch through the summer months, riding out most days before dawn and returning most evenings in time to eat supper at Susanna's table, at her invitation, an arrangement Mrs. Odell observed with open and unconcealed delight, certain long before either of the 2 parties involved were willing to admit it that a wedding was coming to Larkspur Creek before the year was out. Susanna kept the smithy running through that summer with a growing confidence that surprised even herself, her skill at the forge improving steadily under the daily practice of the trade, until by August she could shape a hinge or true a wagon wheel with nearly the same easy competence her husband once had, though she never claimed, nor wished to claim, to have surpassed him. Tobias Reed stayed on as her apprentice, growing into the work with the steady dedication of a young man who had found, in the smithy and in Susanna's quiet leadership, a kind of family he had not known since his own parents' deaths some years before. In September, the patent for the Thatcher homestead arrived by post from the General Land Office in Washington, a formal document bearing the seal of the United States government, and the name Susanna Thatcher inscribed in careful official script as the rightful and sole owner of 160 acres along Larkspur Creek, Wyoming Territory, free and clear of any claim the bank or any other party might ever raise against it. Susanna read the document twice through, standing in the doorway of the smithy much as she had stood reading Cornelius Vance's threatening letter 5 months before, and found that this time the tears that came were not born of fear at all. She rode into town that same afternoon and asked Tobias Reed to mind the forge a while longer, and made her way instead to the small blacksmith shop she had inherited from a trade her father had first taught her. And there, working alone at the forge in the golden light of a September evening, she shaped a plain iron plate, hammered it flat and true, and with a fine chisel she had watched Jebediah use 100 times to letter his own name upon the smithy's original sign, she cut into the metal, letter by careful letter, the words, Susanna Thatcher, proprietor, and beneath it, the date the patent had been issued. She hung the new sign above the smithy door herself, standing on an overturned crate to reach the nail, and when Arthur Atkins rode in from the Circle B that evening and saw it catching the last of the sunset light, he dismounted slowly, Samson's reins forgotten in his hand, and looked at Susanna with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something that went beyond the quiet affection that had grown steadily between them all summer, into a depth of feeling neither of them had yet spoken aloud. "You forged that yourself," he said, not quite a question. "I forged all of it myself, Arthur," Susanna said, climbing down from the crate to stand beside him in the yard, the sign swinging gently overhead on its new iron hooks. "The sign and everything it stands for. I could not have found my way to the law without you, but the fight itself, the forge, the claim, the proof, all of that I built with my own 2 hands, the same as my father taught me, the same as Jebediah taught me. I wanted my name on it, plain and clear, so that no banker in this territory ever mistakes again whose land this is." "No one will ever mistake it," Arthur said softly. "I do not believe there has ever been a claim in this territory more thoroughly and rightfully earned." Susanna looked up at him then, the last of the sunset gold on both their faces, and felt the fullness of everything the past 5 months had cost her and given her in equal measure, the grief and the fear and the fight, and standing at the end of it all, this steady, quiet man who had chosen of his own accord to stay. "Arthur," she said, "I believe I have grieved as much as I need to grieve and fought as hard as I needed to fight, to be certain of what I want for the rest of my life." Arthur's breath caught, and he reached for her hands, both of them roughened now by years at forge and saddle alike, and held them gently between his own. "And what is it you want, Susanna Thatcher?" "I want to keep this smithy burning," she said, "and I want to raise whatever children God sees fit to give us within sight of that cottonwood tree on the hill, so they will always know the ground beneath them was fought for and won fair. And I want you beside me while I do it, Arthur Atkins, not because I need a man to stand between me and the world, but because I have found in you someone who never once tried to take my fight from my hands, only to make certain I had every chance to win it myself. I do not believe I will find that in any other man, were I to search the whole of this territory." "Then you need not search any further," Arthur said, his voice thick with an emotion he made no effort to hide, "because I have known since that first night at your kitchen table, reading your husband's papers by lamplight, that I did not wish to be anywhere in this world but wherever you happened to be standing." He kissed her then gently, beneath the newly forged sign bearing her name, in the golden hush of a Wyoming evening, and Susanna Thatcher, who had buried a husband and fought a bank and learned a trade the world had told her was not hers to learn, found that her heart, which she had believed thoroughly spent by grief, had room enough after all for a second, different, and no less true kind of love. They were married the following spring, in April of 1879, almost exactly 1 year after Jebediah's death, in a small ceremony held in the yard of the smithy itself. Beneath a bower of wild roses, Mrs. Odell had insisted on training up the fence posts for the occasion. Sheriff Wyatt Boone gave Susanna away, having grown fond of her over the long months of her fight against the bank, and old Pete Callahan stood as witness alongside Tobias Reed, who had by then grown into a fine young smith himself under Susanna's patient teaching. The whole of Larkspur Creek turned out for the wedding, drawn as much by genuine affection for the bride as by the particular satisfaction of a town that had watched a corrupt banker humbled and a widow triumphant, and there was dancing that evening in the saloon that lasted well past midnight, fueled by fiddle music and goodwill in equal measure. Cornelius Vance did not attend the wedding, having found, in the months following his public humiliation, that his standing in Larkspur Creek had suffered considerably, depositors withdrawing their business in favor of a rival bank that opened in the next county over, drawn by word of how the Larkspur Creek Trust and Savings Bank had tried to cheat a grieving widow out of her rightful homestead. Within 2 years, Vance had sold his interest in the bank and departed the territory entirely, and the rail spur he had hoped to profit from was built, in the end, a full 3 miles south of Larkspur Creek, along ground that had never belonged to him at all, a fact the townsfolk found no small satisfaction in repeating whenever his name came up in conversation, which grew rarer with each passing year until it was mentioned hardly at all. Susanna and Arthur built their life together on the 160 acres along Larkspur Creek, with the same patient care Jebediah had once put into every hinge and latch of the original smithy, expanding the forge in time to include a second bay for wagon repair, and raising, over the years that followed, a family that filled the small frame house with a noise and warmth Susanna had once feared she would never know again after her first husband's death. Their first child, a son they named Jebediah Arthur Atkins in honor of the man whose land and legacy had brought them together, was born in the winter of 1880, followed 2 years later by a daughter, Ruth, who grew up as comfortable at the forge as her mother had been at that same age, and 2 more children after that, a son and then another daughter, filling out a family that Susanna, in her darkest days after Jebediah's death, could never have imagined finding again. Arthur gave up ranch work within a few years of their marriage, finding that his skills were better used helping Susanna manage the smithy's growing business, and in time, serving as an informal advisor to other homesteaders and widows throughout the county who found themselves tangled in disputes with banks or land agents unfamiliar with the finer provisions of the Homestead Act. He never charged for this help, remembering too well the desperate uncertainty he had found in Susanna's kitchen that first night, and more than one family in the years that followed had cause to bless the name of Arthur Atkins for guidance that saved them their homes and their futures both. The sign above the smithy door remained, through all the years that followed, exactly as Susanna had forged it that September evening in 1878, though in time a second line was added beneath her name, at Arthur's quiet insistence, reading simply, "and family." It hung there still, weathered by decades of Wyoming sun and wind, when Susanna and Arthur's own grandchildren came in later years to learn the trade at the very same forge, listening, as they worked, to the story of how their grandmother had once stood alone against a corrupt banker with nothing but a certified receipt from Cheyenne, and a heart forged as true and unbending as any iron she had ever shaped, and how a quiet drifting cowboy with a lame horse and a good conscience had stopped long enough in Larkspur Creek to help her win a fight that was, in the end, entirely her own to win, and had stayed, in the winning of it, to build a life and a love that neither of them had ever thought to find again.